So we're talking about the book of Eden, chapter 4, and we're into the study guide. And we have something really interesting. I wrote a blog post on this. There are some people, it's not funny. There are some respected leaders who did a video on YouTube that I came across the other day, and they said something about First Peter chapter 2, and they said women are not permitted to teach. And there are two fundamental reasons about that are transcultural and apply to all women for all times. And these are the order of creation and the order of the fall. And I must confess, I'd never heard that second one. I'd heard people talk about the order of creation, but I never heard them say, and the order of the fall. Now, here at the Truth 316 Foundation, we don't talk about the fall. We don't believe that God made the man and the woman with one leg 6 inches shorter than the other, and they were limping around the Garden of Eden until finally they fell. You can tell I used to be a 9th grade English teacher, and my sense of humor is still stuck in junior high. But what did happen? They were attacked. So in Genesis chapter 3, lots of people, Bibles, theologians, whatever, they stick in there the creation, Genesis 2, and the fall in Genesis 3. And I'd like to say, no, we've got the creation, Genesis 2, details, because we have the general outlines in chapter 1. Genesis chapter 2 is the details of creation. And Genesis chapter 3 is the attack, right? You can speak up, feel free. So, the attack. So we've got the attack. So they said there's the order of creation, which there isn't. And there is the order of the fall, which there isn't. And if you want to look that up, go to truth316.com/blog. And my blog from the week of July 13th, 2023 talks about that. And then I propose, no, but there is the order of disobedience because they didn't disobey in the same way. And so in the study guide, the title is Study 2 Responses. So they responded to the temptation from Satan in 2 different ways. So we're going to look at that. I like to tell the story, and I did that on the podcast when Dr. Rodolphe Peter took me and the other doctoral students from the University of Strasbourg Palace. They call it the University Palace. And we went into downtown Strasbourg to what was for many, many centuries, the tallest building in Europe. There's a single spire sticking up from the one side of the cathedral. They didn't bother putting a matching one because that was big enough. And he walked us up to the front of the cathedral, not to the center portal, but there are 2 other large portals, and they have what's called bas-relief sculptures. And there were the wise and unwise virgins who were, kept, give me oil in my lamp, keep me burning, burning, burning. And so some of them had oil in their lamps and some of them didn't. So some were happy and were holding out their lamps and some weren't happy. But on the end, there was another female, and it was Eve. And she was beautiful. She had a crown on her head. She had her hand extended and what looked like an apple. And he said, now come around, with a Strasbourg Alsatian German accent. Come around and look at her back. And on her back were snakes embedded about shoulder levels, writhing down her back. And in between the snakes, there were carbuncles and boils that were, skin disease. And these were signs of her evil. I'm trying to think in French. Get rid of those words. There were evil chemicals bubbling up inside of her and breaking forth in these carbuncles and boils, showing what a mess she was inside. And then the serpent coming down her back showed that she was in league with the first tempter, and she was the second tempter, or the temptress. And I traveled down to Basel, Switzerland, and a couple of other places, and I noticed the same kind of thing, the same kind of representation of Eve as the temptress. And so that's why she was looked down on. If you go back to the Babylonian Talmud, before Jesus, they said that there were 10 curses on Eve. They also had a whole batch of curses on Adam and on on the ground. And so, but we're talking about Eve here. They had 10 curses on Eve. And I remember when Joy came home from studying one whole day in her office at the faculté, à la faculté de théologie évangélique de Bangui, which is in English, the Bangui Evangelical Graduate School of Theology. By the way, I looked on the map the other day, and the Central African Republic, where we lived for 4 years and taught, is now ranked the most poverty-stricken country in the world. So our students there had struggles as we tried to survive as a school there, and yet still give the word of God. And then they said, well, yeah, when we went back to our home areas, if we had difficulties there, we'd already learned how to live with difficulties in Bangui. Anyhow, she came to me and she said, everybody here that we were talking to thinks that there were 4 curses that God made in the Garden of Eden. What do you think the 4 curses were?
The serpent, the ground, and Adam and Eve.
That's right. So he hit the people, he hit the serpent, and he hit the ground. And she said, and she's very careful looking at the structures and the words and stuff. And she says, there were only 2 curses. I mean, the word arar or arur, depending on how you conjugate the thing, only happened twice. One was with the serpent and one was with the ground. And so we only have 2 curses. Jennifer's walking in here too. So I think so. There she is. Hi, Jennifer. Yeah. And then somebody's labeled Truth 316 on their screen. That's a great name. Wow. I'm not sure who that is. That's great. So anyhow, we talked about that evening, and I kind of joked with her at my junior high level. And I said, yeah, but we really know there's a curse on Eve. And she said, she's the professor and the scholar. And she said, no, there's not. So I said, yeah, but we all know that she got, pain in childbirth. That is equivalent of a curse. And I'd had African friends, scholars, pastors, district superintendents tell me that if she got hit with pain in childbirth, that's the equivalent of a curse. Therefore, if she was cursed, she must have deserved it. If she deserved it, she must have been a stinker. That's a translation from Lingala. So she must have been a bad person. And if she was, then God had to watch out for her, and we have to watch out for all her daughters. Therefore, we have to place restrictions on women in the home, restrictions on women in society, and restrictions on women in church. So when they go to those New Testament passages, they come up with restrictions on women. Now, I know we're supposed to talk about chapter 4 and talk about the first 13 verses of Genesis chapter 3, but I'd like to talk about, I'll get there. All right. So in Genesis chapter 3, who did Satan talk to at the tree?
Adam and Eve.
Now, how do we get that idea that there was Adam and Eve?
They were together.
Oh, they're on their honeymoon in the Garden of Eden, B&B. Of course they were together. Who's going to, oh, he was out gathering sticks to make a fire. No, he didn't need to make a fire. They weren't cold. They didn't need sweaters. So, yeah, they were together. Plus, Joyce points out that every time Satan says you, it's plural. Now, if somebody says, no, she was alone, then it's up to them to argue against those 2 facts, that they were together. And it says she gave it to her husband who was with her. So there's 3 reasons. So if you want to say that she was all by herself, and there's so many children's Bibles, you take up a picture and there's the serpent hanging down and there's the gal and they got a leaf, placed discreetly across her or whatever. And she's all by herself. That's our grand twins had I forget where it was a video or a book, and both Adam and Eve were at the tree. I put that up on my Facebook thread just because I thought this is great. They got both of them there. So they're both at the tree. Satan's talking to them both. They're both listening to Satan's words. Now, Jesus called him in John 8? What was the passage?
44. 8:44.
John 8:44. Can somebody read John 8:44? There's some people that have been criticizing Jesus, and he says, you're just like your father, the devil. That's what's going on at John 8:44.
I have it.
Okay.
You are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning. He does not stand in the truth, and because there's no truth in him, when he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies.
Now, there was a war when the first President Bush was president, and the bad guy he was talking about the mother of all evils, or the mother of all wars, or mother of all battles. It was his Iraqi way of describing that in Middle Eastern terms. This is a big deal. This is the mother of all things. See, and I forget which translation takes that in John and actually translates that he's the father of liars. Okay. When I looked at the Greek, I thought, well, I don't know if I would translate it that way, but that's the basic idea. So Satan is the source of these lies, and he lies in order to do what?
Murder.
Yeah, he's a murderer. So I'm lying because I want to kill you. And did Adam and Eve end up dead? So he succeeded. So he had to get him to disobey by eating the fruit, and he got him to eat the fruit. Now, here's an interesting thing. When Eve ate the fruit, what are the reasons she ate the fruit? Were these bad reasons? Were these prideful reasons? Were these twisted reasons? Why did she eat the fruit? She saw the fruit was good for this and good for that and good. What verse would that be in?
Verse 3:6.
You want to read that?
Oh, so when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was also a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate.
So desire to make one wise. No. Is that a bad desire? No. It looks good, tastes good, smells good, sounds good, feels good, you know. So that's why she did it. Doesn't say she was a stinker. It doesn't say she, out of her desire to bring down the whole world, out of her desire to open that box old Pandora reached it. There is no pagan theology in here, no pagan philosophy. And yet all around us, there is this blame the woman. And that's not in Genesis chapter 3. She's not the bad guy. Did she disobey? Yes. Oh, well, then God really had to punish her. Pardon me. What was the punishment for eating the fruit? Genesis chapter 2. What'd God say?
That's
You shall surely die.
You're going to die. Did she die? Yes. Was she punished? Yes. Does she need an extra punishment? No. So let's not give her an extra punishment. Unless we really don't like her and we want to come up for some reason, and we want to invent something and lay it on top of that, or we're used to it, but there's no reason to make her out as a bad guy. Some people have listened to the Eden podcast and they say, Bruce, you're really hard on the men. I don't think so. I think the people are already hard enough on Adam. And the problem is that people have been really hard on Eve. And I think we need to make a distinction that they should not be as hard on Eve as, who else was hard on Eve? The woman you gave to be with me, she, so, there's stinker number one. She's stinker number two. Now, when God said to go into the promised land, we're shifting time a little bit. When the Israelites left Egypt with the Exodus and they wandered around the desert, could have made it faster, but because they disobeyed, God said, you're going to take 40 years. We're going to get rid of that bad generation and your kids will come in. All right. When they came in, the rules were this: set up 6 special cities of refuge, 3 on this side of the Jordan River and 3 on that side of the Jordan River, so that they're within easy access of anybody. And if you kill somebody accidentally, let's back up. If you kill somebody, then what's that word called? There was somebody who had to seek vengeance. Right. Okay. So that person is, if you killed somebody, you didn't go into an electric chair after, 25 years. There was somebody from the family usually, and they come and they put you to death. And everybody stands around and goes, that's right. So that's for first-degree murder. If you shed blood and kill somebody, then you get to have your blood shed and you die. That's for first-degree murder. And why were these cities of refuge set up? In case you kill somebody accidentally, not by murder of forethought. And so you get to go, and you get to go into that city of refuge. And then what was it? When the Jubilee comes, or there was something like that too. Eventually you get out.
The high priest dies.
So guess what? They had first-degree murderers and they had second-degree murderers. And it depended on your intent when you killed somebody. Both killed somebody. Let's go back to the Garden of Eden. Both ate. Both died. What was the level of intent? He did it on purpose. We'll talk about that in a second. She didn't do it on purpose. She had to be talked into it, deceived. So she did. She was deceived. She ate it. But she was a second-degree eater, and he's a first-degree eater. Now, that order of eating, that order of rebellion, disobedience, is picked up by Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 2. So let's go to 1 Timothy 2 for a minute. I'll let you get there. I'll talk about the verses before that. In 1 Timothy, the whole book of 1 Timothy, Paul says, Tim, and he's thinking back, and he says to Timothy, you know, I left you in Ephesus because some of the wonderful overseers, teachers, and he uses pronouns that include men and women. So some of the guys and gals who were overseers and teaching, some of them, not all of them, not even half of them necessarily, some of them went astray. So I left you in Ephesus to work with those people who went astray. Well, how do you work with those people who went astray? One, you tell them to stop doing it. And two, you throw them out. That's what we do with in the old days. I had a friend who was a pastor, and he ended up selling furniture. And he had no hope of going back into the ministry ever again, you know, because he was a pastor under discipline. Well, that's not what Paul did. In 1 Timothy, he says to Tim, I want you to, in 1 Timothy, the first couple of verses, I left you that you might correct them. So what do you do? Well, they were doing it wrong. Now they need to learn how to do it right. And I keep waiting for the time where it says, this is how we retrained them. And you get up to chapter 2, verse 8, and he starts talking about some of the men who are causing disruption they're causing disputing and anger and doubting and stuff in a prayer meetings. That doesn't normally happen in prayer meetings. And I don't think they're describing a prayer meeting. It says in every place, meaning in church. Not meaning everywhere, but in every place. Like the temple was the holy place, you know, or the synagogue was the place. The churches became the place. So 1 Timothy 2:8, in that place, when you're worshiping, praying, and prophesying, if you're teaching incorrectly and you're causing all kinds of havoc, the guys who are doing this, they need to stop. And then he says I wish, which is the apostolic desire of the command, the beginning of 2:8. And for all of that, you got to go to book 3. Okay, sorry. But then he says, likewise in 2:9. And there's no I wish. It's just likewise. So the likewise is I wish. So verse 8, I want those wayward overseers among the men who were doing wrong. I want them to stop doing that. And then in verse 9, he's talking about the wayward women overseers that need to be corrected. And verses 9 and 10, he talks about good stuff that they did and bad stuff that they might do. And then he gets to verse 11 and he says, a woman. No, sorry, the women. No, he doesn't do that. In Greek, he says woman without an article, not plural, singular. And I studied my Greek and I looked it up and it says, when you don't have an article, that's called an anarthrous, anarthrous, anarthrous noun. And when I got to use number 3 for an anarthrous noun, it meant talking about a subgroup of that noun. So he says, woman, let learn. What subgroup of women? Not all women, believers and unbelievers, not all Christian women, not all Christian women overseers, but the Christian women overseers who had gone astray and were being corrected by Timothy. That's the whole reason Timothy's in Ephesus. Now he gets to train them. And did they want to learn, or do you have to make them learn? The Greek says, let learn. They want to learn. He gets to let them learn. How should they learn? Well, in those days, if you were a rabbinical student, you had to do it in silence and in subjection as a rabbinical student. Paul learned that way. And so these ladies that are being corrected, these wayward overseers, he says, let them learn in silence and in subjection. Because I don't want them doing what they were doing wrong. That was in verse 12. And then he ends up again, he wraps it all up again, saying in silence. So he's saying the commandment in verse 11, that's the main part of that verse. Let them learn. And then people make a big deal about verse 12. I don't want them teaching. Well, that's a sub point. You could actually get rid of verse 12 and still keep the sense of what he's saying. And yet people make out as if verse 12 is the big idea. It's not. It's the sub point. So he's told them this extraordinary different kind of treatment for wayward overseers. Now, there were first degree wayward overseers. We know their names of two of them, Hymenaeus and Alexander. And those bad boys did it on purpose. And they rejected conscience, made a shipwreck of their faith. That's the end of chapter 1 in 1 Timothy. And those, they were going to get trained. How were they trained? The end of chapter 1 of 1 Timothy.
Delivering them unto Satan.
Yeah, he says, I've abandoned them to Satan. Okay, whoa, that's a tough grader. Yeah, you're not going to get 100% out of that guy. So they were first degree sinners. So where does all this stuff come from? Well, I told you, Eve was a second degree eater. God had in mind the cities of refuge for second degree killers. Paul says around verse 13, chapter 1, 13, 14, 15, he said, I was the chief of sinners, but I did it ignorantly and in unbelief. I was a second degree sinner. And God judged me by appointing me to his service. It's an outrageous grace of God. He's not going to forget that way of treatment. And he's not going to forget that way of treatment for those dear hearts, those men and women who were overseers, but went astray. So he says to Timothy, I want you to retrain these men, and I want you to retrain these women, overseers. And then he gives the reason, and it's not in 13 and 14. It's not the order of creation, and it's not the order of the fall. Yeah, couldn't even pull that up. Not the order of creation, verse 13, not the order of the fall, verse 14. Instead, he says something very interesting. He says, by the way, when did Eve get her name in Genesis chapter 3? Do you know when?
After the attack.
Yeah. So in Genesis 3, verse 20, after God's done talking to them, then Adam gets he's on the stage all of a sudden by himself, gets to do whatever he wants to do to obey God and repent or whatever, be holy, be a leader. And what does he do? He uses the naming formula that was used in Genesis chapter 2, I.W. Sir Lancelot, for the animals, indicating that he rules over those animals, just like that nice puppy you got there licking your cheek. Yeah. So he says, I.W. Eve. Because if God talked to me about death, then yeah, you're the woman for the livers, people who are living. And it's a very snarky way and a bad thing, because in Genesis 5:2, God called their name Adam, Mr. and Mrs. Adam. And now the man arrogates unto himself, I love that phrase, he arrogates unto himself that name, Adam. And just me, I'm the only real true person made from the red-brown dirt, and you're below me. And he starts to rule over her. Okay, so let's go back to 1 Timothy. Paul says, I was a sinner, but I did it ignorantly and unbelief. I was a second-degree sinner. And eventually he talks about the first-degree sinners, Hymenaeus and Alexander. He talks about persecutors who were like himself. He had 3 sins. He was a blasphemer, a persecutor, and disruptive. So he talks first about the blasphemers, end of chapter 1. Then he talks second about the persecutors, chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. And then he gets around to the disruptors, the one who were teaching bad and causing problems. Disruptor subgroup number 1, 1 Timothy 2:8. Disruptive subgroup number 2, 1 Timothy 2:9 and following. And so then he gets into the specifics. Let them learn who this subgroup of women. And then he says in verse 13, what does he say in verse 13? What are the names that we see in verse 13? Somebody else. How about Carolyn? You want to read 1 Timothy
Okay.
2:13?
For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor.
Okay, so we got two big deals there. Who is he calling them?
Adam and Eve.
Adam and Eve. Yet he's talking about what happened earlier in Genesis chapter 3 when they didn't have the names Adam and Eve. This is an error. This is a major error on his part to call them Adam and Eve. It should be the man and the woman, unless he's trying to call attention to these two distinct individuals. At least that's my theory. I didn't read that anywhere else, and I haven't run this past the committee, so maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think so. He's making a big deal about these two different individuals. And then he says, he wasn't deceived and she was. And most people will pound the pulpit and say, see that she was deceived. No, if she was deceived, she was a second-degree eater and he was a first-degree eater. So you say, and Adam he sinned and she was deceived and she sinned. That's the way it's got to be delivered. So he's making a point that reinforces, why do I treat these wayward overseers so gently? Because they're second-degree sinners like me. And they're second-degree sinners like Eve. That'll preach. That's really good. Then he gets down to verse 15. And what's the antecedent to the pronoun she in the first part of 1 Timothy 2:15? She is
Yep.
who?
Oh, that's that Eve.
Eve.
The woman.
Yeah, the woman, Eve. She will be saved through, and the Greek says, the childbirth or the childbearing. There's an article, the. Well, what is the childbearing except the promise that God gave to her? I will multiply your sorrowful toil and your conception. And up to the serpent, he threatened him. He says, her offspring will crush your head. So the Messiah, so Eve is going to be saved through the birth of the Messiah? Of course. And the rest of that verse that finishes up the passage says, if they continue in, it's just referring back to these women who need to be acting and living properly. And then 1 Peter 3 is astounding. He says, pistos ha logos, 3 Greek words. Pistos, 2 Greek words. Pistos ha, the logos, word. Faithful is the word. Oh, let's look back in John chapter 1. Who's the word? In the beginning was the word. And the word was with God, and the word was God, and all things were created by the word. Still thinking back in the Garden of Eden and prior to that. And so Paul says, pistos ha logos, faithful is the word, or faithful is Jesus. And then the rest of verse 1 in Greek says, if anyone aspires to oversight, he or she desires a good work. So these people who have been under discipline and have been receiving rabbinical retraining can get the good news because of Jesus. And Paul said in 1 Timothy chapter 1, because of the faithful word, pistos ha logos, I was restored. And therefore in chapter 3, because of this faithful word, you guys and gals can be restored. If you're aspiring to oversight. Now I got a list. I got a checklist in the rest of chapter 3 coming up here. You have to be a faithful spouse, and you have to be above reproach, and you have to do all those other things. Not husband of one wife, but a faithful spouse. It's a Hebrew idiom, Greek idiom. At any rate, we do a workshop on 1 Timothy. That's workshop number 3. And here's a commercial. If you'd like to take all 4 workshops, we'd like you to pay $69 for all 4. That's a lot. What we really would like you to do is to join us, become a true partner for $25 a month. And if you go to true316.com/partner, you'll see the details and you can sign up. Even if you go to true316.com/workshop, you can see that too. We talk about it. You can pay the normal price, which we really don't that's fine, but we'd prefer you become a true partner, because if you do, we're going to be moving to much more podcast episodes coming up, and that costs editing and a whole lot of other work. And I have to hire or recruit volunteers. It's a lot of work. And so your monthly donations goes to that, gets the word out. End of commercial. So is it a big deal that we get Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 to 13 correct? It is when you hit 1 Timothy. And the fire and brimstone that's been raining on women from the pulpits in a certain SBC denomination, the largest denomination in the United States, and a lot of other churches, because they think they're doing it right. And they think, see, she was deceived. What a bad person. Or see, it's about all women. And Martin Luther didn't help us. He said this was about wives. Where'd that come from? Well, they were all married pretty much, but no, maybe not. In Ephesus, there were many, many temple prostitutes who weren't married. And there was a lot of them, a high percentage of single women. More recent studies are telling us about Ephesus. I don't have to worry about that. I'm just talking about the female teachers that had been put into ministry, and some of them had gone astray and needed to be corrected. And so why would we be so gentle in correcting them? Because they were like Eve, who wasn't the big time sinner. They were the second degree sinners. Now I see Emily wanting to say something, but she's on mute. No, you don't, just shaking your head.
No, it was just, that's a good point. Sorry.
Okay. Okay, good. Jennifer, did you want to make a comment?
Actually, yes. My question is just trying to wrangle with the bit about, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. So, I feel like I remember in Genesis, there was also this sort of formation of saying that, and I was curious about whether or not that was something meant to be, because it's like I'm trying to figure out where it's at, but it says that she ate and she was a sinner. But there's no commentary of what that means that Adam was. And if we're making a distinction that she was maybe it's not in Genesis. I keep trying to go back and find it.
Oh, it might not be in Genesis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And anyway, I was just looking at it on the computer last night and I forgot where it was at. So at any rate, but that same formulation, but if we're not saying what Adam is, but we're drawing from this that he was a more significant transgressor or whatever of this because he ate knowingly. I don't know. I'm trying to understand, and I'm curious, does this in the Greek here in Timothy 2:14, does the and became a transgressor and that conjunction tie that to the woman, or does that tie that to Adam? And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived. Could it be possibly comma and became a transgressor? So Adam was not deceived and became a transgressor. But it's like pulling out, but the woman was deceived. So it was Adam who became a transgressor. I don't know. Because it does feel like, I don't know, it is really hard to parse this without feeling like it's an emphasis on women having problems versus, the male.
Yeah. So we've had devotions on women being the big time trouble. We've had sermons on this. We have hymns that even talk about it. It's just in the water anymore.
Yeah.
I'm flipping back here. I got my Greek out here.
Mm-hmm.
So no, I don't think the Greek lines up with making a distinction. It's basically she had to be deceived to get her to sin.
Mm-hmm.
But what you do is you bring up a point like, was he that
My
bad?
Greek translation doesn't even have the word and. It just has, but the woman made a mistake as she was beguiled. And that word mistake is made a blunder, not fell into sin. And that's also referenced in Romans 5:14 when they're talking about Adam. Death established its reign from Adam until Moses, even over those who had not sinned in the same way as Adam. That's the sin word.
And what translation is that?
Adam gets called out.
What? I didn't hear the
This is the source New Testament with a ton of Greek notes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So tonight we're talking about the Hebrew text. So I'm going to stick with that for now. I mean, she did sin. I mean, she did disobey. She did eat the fruit. Oh, and she died. So we got that.
Bruce, did she die spiritually, or are you saying this caused human physical death? I'm not clear.
Well, we know from here, at this point in history, we know what that meant. That we know, well, we know they became mortal. They could have been thinking, wow, in the day you eat thereof, you shall die, and they were waiting. Am I going to fall over you now or an hour from now? So God was very gracious in not making them die right away. Oh, how gracious was he? Oh, I think it took 900 years. So he was very gracious, giving them long lives. But
did they even know what it meant to die?
Oh, there's some mean-spirited people that think that there had been lots of death around by that time, but I don't think so. So no, she doesn't necessarily know what that means. Yeah.
That's mean-spirited. I
I
have heard that theory, and I'm kind of open to it, but I'm no expert.
I would think that they would know, since God had to kill animals to make them skins. They would know death from the animals around them, even if they didn't.
Yeah, that
fully
happened.
understand what it meant for themselves.
That happened after all this other part of Genesis 3. That's at the end of Genesis 3. I don't see any indication that there were even malaria carrying mosquitoes at that point. I don't know, but
Really?
when I was a little kid, that's what I worried about. So let me go back to what's clear. So Joy and I both had some of the same professors when we went to seminary, and one of them said, no, there are seminary jokes. I found that when I went to seminary, so I won't tell you those jokes, but one of the phrases is where the Bible, okay, there is one here. I'll tell you that joke about the pastor, where the Bible was clear, he was clear. And where the Bible wasn't clear, he was clear. So that's a put down, So what we try to do is say, where stands it written? Put your finger on the text so we can see a couple things that are important. Take a look at this. In verse 9, chapter 3, Genesis 3:9, the Lord God called to the man. Now, at that point, they're both called the man. I won't make a big point out of that, but, he did. I mean, could have been both of them. Maybe it was him. But anyhow, he says, where are you? And now the guy volunteers. She ate first. Why does he talk first? So he said, we heard the sound of you in the garden, and we were afraid because we were naked, so we hid ourselves. Is that what he says?
No.
He sounds like a pirate. Aye, aye. I heard you. I was naked, and I hid myself. Oh, where did that single-minded focus on yourself come from? What is that? A little bit of, we have little kids, if you have little kids, you don't have to teach them how to be that way, but they are. It looks like we're seeing depravity in the guy already. And verse 11, God says, who told you? Wow, watch that. Who told you? If somebody tells you something, what do you hear? You hear their voice. So now God is prompting this guy, saying, all right, you're eye focused, but I want to get you off this eye focus. So now I'm going to give you a hint. Who told you that you were naked? Well, nobody told him he was naked. All right. But there was a voice. So now he gets to talk about the voice. So he says, well, there was a serpent that came along and lied about you like crazy. And I believed him. And oh, wait a minute. Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? You heard my voice. Verse 12, the man said, he says nothing about the serpent. Verse 12, the man said, well, the woman Now, a lot of people read this wrong and they say, whom you gave to me. And even he didn't get that wrong. He says, the woman whom you gave to be with me. And there she is side by side with him. She gave me the fruit from the tree and I ate. Not a word about the serpent at all. So, you know, if there's a plate that crashes to the floor in the kitchen and all the relatives are at the house for some reason, and some of the parents walk into the kitchen and there's some kids there, they're all over the other corner of the kitchen from where the broken plate is. You know, we didn't do that. And so you say, who did that? And then, well, Billy did that, or Susie did that. That they're pointing to others. So blame is going on here. Yeah, she did give him and she was, given by God to be with him. But look at the attitude problem, I think, that's in there. So then God says, okay, I heard from you, buddy. So he turns to her and he says, okay, your turn. What have you done? And the woman says, well, the man, he shouldn't have. No, she doesn't say that. She says, I've been standing here and it's hit me. I figured out what's going on. I was deceived before, but I'm not deceived now. And he didn't mention the guy the spirit, the serpent that attacked us, but I'm going to mention him because he did it. So she says, the serpent, I'm reading the New Revised Standard Version just for fun tonight. The serpent tricked me and I ate. Okay, so the serpent tricked me and I ate. Now God is going to judge him and her, but before he does, and he's talking to her now, and he's going to talk to her in 16, but before he talks to her in 16, he's going to interrupt that and put a parenthesis in here, and he's going to talk to the serpent tempter because of what she said. She pointed out the troublemaker. She denounced the attacker. And by doing so, when the man hid the attacker, I think he sort of kind of moved to the side of the attacker. Satan denied the truth of God's word and said, oh, you're not going to die. And you want to be like God. And God says, no. So I think he's been moving to the side of Satan. When she denounces Satan, blames him, points him out, and I ate, she confesses, she's moving to the side of the Lord. At least I think there's indications of that. So then the Lord says, well, Satan, what she just said isn't quite right, but no, that's not what he says. In verse 14, the Lord said to the serpent, because you have done this. Basically, he's quoting her. He's taking her judgment that he was the deceiver and the attacker. And he's saying, okay, because you've done this, cursed is you are. So anyway, we go off on that. We'll talk about that in the next workshops about, this is really interesting. In Hebrew, you can hear the poetry of it. There are 6 things that God says to the serpent tempter in judgment. Because you cursed is all the days of your life. There's 6. And when he gets to the man, because you cursed is all the days of your life, the same 6 points. And in Hebrew, if that happens, then there's something going on. There's a meaning between the parallel structures. So to the serpent and to the man, he says the same thing. And people all the time talk about how God came down hard and judged all 3 in the same way, because they were all involved in blaming. No, the serpent wasn't involved in blaming. And no, the woman wasn't involved in blaming. And then they go, well, and they were all received a curse. Well, the word curse is not in the words to the woman. See that? And Joy points out that in Genesis 3:16, none of the 6 elements up here and down there, none of those are in here with her. Instead, there's a good-bad pattern alternating back and forth. And it's sort of like the fruit of good and evil, the tree. You got the good and the evil. Now you got the good and the bad results from eating of that fruit, from disobeying. So that's coming when we do the workshop on those verses. At this point, you get a free for all. Any question, any verse, anything you want to talk about, or something still from this passage.
In Genesis 3:16, you've mentioned that what God said to Eve about that your desire is for your husband, that word teshuka. I've heard it elsewhere. I think it was Catherine Bushnell who said
Yeah.
that is more of a turning. It's not necessarily this desire, but that turning is to your husband. And in the sense that she's turning from God, she'll be turning towards her husband, and he will lord it over you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
How come you said it more as desire versus turning? I'm just
Sure.
curious.
well, actually, we followed the Hebrew text and she didn't. Okay. So she's following the Greek translation in the LXX, which is called the Septuagint.
Okay.
And the LXX is a translation. By who? Oh, it happens to be by those same people that talked about 10 curses on Eve. So there might have been a little pressure in there. I don't know. I would like somebody else to do a doctoral dissertation on some of this stuff.
Yeah.
We would love that. We would really like to have a lot of doctoral participation in our research, Old Testament and New Testament. The one thing we definitely stand on is Joy's dissertation on Genesis 2 and 3. She is the Old Testament scholar. I think she's the world's expert on this stuff. When you get to the New Testament, when I talk about my research, I am not a Greek scholar. I have my doctoral studies in practical theology, which is missions and evangelism and church planting. But I've made a big time study in hermeneutics. So that's what attracts me, the patterns. So like we've got the bell curve in Genesis 2 and 3. In Ephesians 5 and 6, I discovered the bell curve is there. And in the Old Testament, there's different places. They have a jump, high jump pattern. Again, we can't go into that right now. But in Ephesians 5, we have the jump, high jump pattern. And in 1 Timothy, we have the jump, high jump pattern. Well, Paul is a studied, accomplished rabbi. He would know all that stuff. And he decides to write his books that way. So I think what I've talked about is also very defensible.
Mm-hmm.
The question about turning, though, is from the translation by the Greek scholars, and they talked about turning. And a lot of good people that we love and endorse us about other things, they say, no, it's turning. Turning from who and turning to where and turning why? Joy basically says, look, teshuka, the Hebrew word, is used 3 times. And each of those times it's used, it doesn't mean turning. It means desire. Now, there's a critter that desires to eat up Cain. Okay, there's no turning there. There's, I'm going to jump out and eat you. That's a thing. That's not human desire. Okay, so the woman has human desire in her marriage relation to the man. So who else talks about human desire? Oh, I know. Song of Solomon. And Solomon and his lover, and I've read a commentary recently, it talked about his wife. Okay, so Song of Solomon and his wife, he loves her. He desires teshuka her. Okay, good. Let's stop there. Let's take that and keep rolling. Now, if you want to blame her as the junior temptress, then you're going to go like the ESV. Your desire is, I forget how the ESV talks about it, but it's bad. They've added some extra words. They shouldn't do that. Dr. Phil Payne has talked about mistakes by the ESV, and the ESV says we're on purpose complementarian, and we're going to go that way. I don't want to get into this battle of complementarian and egalitarian. I don't need those labels. I don't need to do that. We're not in that war. We're just talking about the plain, true value of the 11 Hebrew words in Genesis 3:16, and desire is one of them. So he looks into her heart and he says, your desire, and there's no verb. So you put in the word is. Okay. Your desire is to your husband. Okay. I'd like to say she loves him. And Joy says, that's too strong for that word, but you could say her affection is to her husband. There's no turning. And if your turning is from somebody to somebody or from something away from, and they get into all these other things. Mm-hmm. So when you're interpreting, you look for the literal sense if possible. If not, you move to the simplest level of abstraction if possible. If that sense makes no sense, then you seek another sense. And some people are way up here, speculating. And when they do, then all this patriarchal, godless, pagan stuff somehow just seems to take them away. We don't want to do that. We want the verse.
The true 3:16.
Mm-hmm. When was kind of the turning as far as the pollution starting in the translations? Because I've got the 1599 Geneva Study Bible, and it goes a little bit closer to the King James version, but it's still like the titles are still like Eve entices her husband, so it's
Yeah,
just like,
well, the titles aren't the translation. So you're asking
Right.
about the translation,
the translation
or
is
you're talking about the publisher's titles.
well,
So
no,
let,
like
let
when in church history did it start becoming this thing where all of a sudden women are like the temptresses, the ones who screwed
yeah, Adam,
everything.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
and he has a fine tradition ever since Adam. So that's Adam. Or we could say the Babylonian Talmud writers when they came up with 10 curses against Eve. Or we could say the Septuagint when they kind of messed around with turning. They also messed around with line 1 in Genesis 3:16. They talked about a liar in wait. The best we can do is, and that's what we decided to do. We had to decide. We're going to stick with the Hebrew text, and we're going to stick with the plain sense of the Hebrew text. And so we carefully go, but you are allowed to look for the meaning, the parallelisms going on here. So in the A, B, C, D, C prime, B prime, A prime, and when you get down to 3:16, that's the A prime section. Oh, look over here. In A, there's a thing called a linchpin where there's one word that links down to the following verse, and there's one that goes back to the previous verse. And over here, your sorrowful toil links down to the curse on the ground to the man, and he has to Itzabon, and your conception Heron links back up to Zerah in 3:15, and we have conception of the offspring who's going to crush Satan's head. So that kind of pattern we can do, and if we notice the good bad pattern coming out of the 2 kinds of fruit, we can do. I think the passage is beautiful and it ought to open up right away. By the way, if you really want to go into the Hebrew, you can. It costs a lot to buy somebody's doctoral dissertation. And Joy and I talked about it, and she said, no, let's set it at $40. So if you go to true316.com/shop, SHOP, one of the first ones that'll pop up is her dissertation. And we took it out and had it professionally scanned. Some of the pages are fading a little bit. We did this in the days before computers. So we don't have a file for the original 407-page dissertation, but we have the printed version. And so you can get her whole 407-page dissertation. If you want to look at the stuff we're talking about, go to chapters 3 and 4, and you'll see the Hebrew diagrams. But there's plenty of stuff written in English that you can dig into the Hebrew too, but if you can't do that, you can still look at the English text in there. All right, we've hit our time limit.
Do you have anything to say about when God says to Adam, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten the tree of which I commanded you?
Oh yeah, sure. That's great. Okay. So we'll pick that up in session 8, but we can talk about it for a moment now. So remember what he said, who told you? He's talking about voices.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I commanded you, talking about voices.
Mm-hmm.
And the man says, you gave it to me. It's her fault.
Mm-hmm.
And God picks up on that. He said, okay, let's think about what your testimony was. You talked about her voice. See? So because you referred to her voice, her words, you're blaming her. Now I'm going to talk about my words, and you disobeyed my words.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, boom, here comes the judgment. And he just saw the serpent get cursed himself. So, oh no, my mentor, my model, the first rebel, and I'm the second rebel, the first one got cursed. And God says, cursed, oh no, is the ground. Woo, it missed. Wow.
Dodge that bullet.
Yeah.
I mean, he should have had a wonderful, repentant attitude, grateful for God's grace. And then he goes on when he has the stage all by himself in 3:20, and he says, yeah, I'm going to treat you right now. I'm going to dub you, Lady Luck, Lady Birth, whatever, mother of all living. He's got a real attitude problem. Oh, by the way, how good a guy was he after they left the Garden of Eden? A lot of people will blame people for the behavior of their kids. She says when their firstborn is born in chapter 4, verse 1, I have begotten a man, the Lord. That's the literal Hebrew passage. And that could be that she says, I've had a baby. Thank you, God. Or it could be, I have given birth to the Messiah. So in faith, how's she know? Why not? Why shouldn't the first one be the Messiah? So I have begotten a man, the Lord. That's what the Hebrew says. So she seems to have a righteous attitude outside of Eden. And we don't hear anything about Adam, but somebody was a model to Cain. Who could that have been? I'm not going to preach that, but I'm going to suggest it. So Cain was a spiritual line of Adam, and Abel, where did he learn to be righteous? Spiritual line of Eve. I haven't heard Joyce say that. So, okay, just that's extra fluff. But I think there's a pretty strong case here that we've got 2 levels of sin. And that was what we called the chapter here. I think that's what we called it. So we've got the order of disobedience.
Oh,
it's a new phrase as of this week. 2 responses, I called it. So we've got 2 different responses, and it looks pretty good for her. No, she died. Okay, well, yeah. So she sinned and she got the ultimate judgment. Did she die spiritually then? Well, she rebuked. I mean, she revealed her attacker. She confessed to God. She made a statement of faith in chapter 4, verse 1. Was she spiritually dead? Are those signs? Her desire still was for her husband. She looks pretty good to me. I won't make a case that I don't know. How was he saved? Well, that doesn't come out as good, So we can't say too much, but we can find other verses in the Bible that talk about it. So you let the scripture interpret scripture, and there are verses, but none of them come to my mind right now. So I'll let you talk to Mimi in the other workshops and make her tell you. Okay.
Could I just ask one final thing?
Sure.
Kind of springboarding off that last. I just noticed something as I was looking through this verse, that Cain was tilling the soil. That was like the curse that Adam had to undergo. Curse will be the soil, but then Abel was tending the livestock, and Eve was the mother of all living. So I'm wondering if there's some symbolism in that, or if that's sort of carrying through in their children. Thoughts on that?
Well, we know that there was a definition of tasks and rule. Just they started sharing the load and specializing. I've never heard anybody talk about the difference there.
Okay.
Yeah, that's interesting. But the only other place where it does talk about working the ground, and it does count, is the Genesis chapter 5, verse 29. So that's where the parents of Noah, baby Noah, maybe the dad, is going to be born now. And it just was born, I forget, but they're going to name him. And they're going to name him with a name that has to do with relief from the sorrowful toil from working the cursed ground with their hands. So you get a real clear definition in 529 that the curse on the ground applied to field work. So when you were doing field work, that's when you had that sorrowful toil. And in Africa, boy, I'll tell you who does the field work. It's the women. And the men, they're walking around watching for serpents. Not really, kind of leaning against a tree, but So she certainly was working the ground when she got out and out of Eden, and he was too. And so they both experienced that sorrowful toil. Okay, I want to stop the video for now, and if we have a last second, we can talk about that.